as early as the 15th century. But when it comes to cultural works, modernist styles are usually only said to have begun taking off in the late 19th to early 20th century. And what were those styles like, you ask? Well, the most classic example would be modern art, which is the term used to categorize the various styles of drawing and painting and sculpture that emerged around the dawn of the 20th century, including Cubism, Impressionism, Expressionism, and Futurism. These were styles that prioritized the use of color and shape in all sorts of imaginative and creative ways, in the pursuit of art that captured the visual essence of something and the artist's feelings about it, which the modernists agreed was the core purpose of art of this sort. This contrasted with the understood values of pre-modern drawing and painting and sculpture, which were more fixated on priorities like creating the most accurate visual representation of a thing or honoring the dominant political religious values of the time. Pablo Picasso was perhaps the most famous modern visual artist of the 20th century and created highly abstracted renditions of people and things that were much beloved for their vivid colors and contorted shapes, even though he rejected pre-modern ideas that art should strive for accurate representation above all else. His works were nevertheless praised for capturing something fundamental about his subjects. As he put it, I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them. Modernist painters like Jackson Pollock or Pete Mondrian went even further, creating works that didn't even aspire to be representations of objects at all, just pure demonstrations of artistic self-expression through mastery of color, composition, and material. Modernist architecture and interior design were a similar story. In the pre-modern era, the design of buildings and furniture had been trending towards the increasingly detailed and decorative, with elaborately ornate facades and all the rest. The modernists, by contrast, wanted to ditch what they saw as the pointless fussiness of traditional home design in favor of designing buildings and furniture more preoccupied with giving the people who inhabited these spaces maximum functional and comfortable tools for living. The great modernist architect Frank Lloyd Wright, for instance, hated the sort of houses that had become popular in the Victorian age, which he dismissed as little more than boxes with fancy lids. So he instead pioneered buildings that had much simpler, cleaner geometric designs with much larger, open rooms that flowed into one another and created more functional spaces for 20th century families to inhabit. The modernist furniture designer Charles Eames, similarly, is today best remembered for pioneering new styles of chairs that, although perhaps unremarkable looking today, were very revolutionary for their time in terms of prioritizing values like comfort, affordability, and unpretentious appearance over decoration and detail. You could still appreciate them for their beauty, but it was a beauty that came from form following function, as one big shot of the day put it. In the realm of literature, meanwhile, modernism is usually associated with the rise of unsentimental authors who believed that the fundamental purpose of a story was allowing the author to express something deep and important about the human condition in a pure and honest way. This was in contrast to pre-modern authors who became associated with writing stories that were unrealistically upbeat, moralistic, and reliant on tidy, linear plots, which were not reflective of the way that human life actually worked. The great modernist authors who emerged during the early 20th century, like James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and Virginia Woolf, preferred to tell more unstructured, morally complicated stories about relationships and emotions and society that were meaningful to the reader precisely because they weren't just fun little adventures. This was the true essence of fiction, they said. Honest depictions of what life was actually like, featuring characters who spoke and thought and behaved in the messy, confusing way people actually did. It was an attitude that was very much embraced by writers working in other mediums as well, including poetry, plays, and eventually movies and television. Okay, so the broad style of postmodernism is usually said to have emerged in the latter decades of the 20th century, and as the name suggests, refers to anything that can be seen to reject or transcend the ideas of the modern. And since, as we just saw, modern style things were mostly defined by prioritizing a certain sense of purity of form, the postmodernists were mostly defined by rejecting every possible expectation of the form itself, often in ways that could seem funny, sarcastic, or even hostile to the expectations of the person consuming that cultural product. A lot of this was bound up in the embrace of late 20th century postmodern philosophies, which were often quite hostile to modernist notions that the world could be understood through logic and that objective truths were knowable. If one assumes that the world is instead defined by a sort of irrational anarchy, then objectives like seeking to make the purest, perfect form of something become inherently pretentious and absurd, and that therefore makers of culture should instead simply embrace the inherent impossibility of man's attempt to organize and understand the world around him, rather than create a cultural work with the intent of serving some grand purpose or meaning. Maybe the work should be unapologetically meaningless. A very early example of what we would now call postmodern art was this piece, Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, which is literally just a urinal which Duchamp submitted to a gallery in 1917 to test the limits of what could be considered art. Later in the century, other visual artists would rebel in similar ways, creating extremely unconventional works that would startle or confuse even the most controversial painters and sculptors of the modernist era. This could include declaring bizarre arrangements of seemingly random objects as art, creating art that consciously copied the form of some supposedly unartistic thing in the broader culture, like advertising, or just showing a kind of irreverent attitude towards the whole idea of being an artist, an attitude that was as defiant towards Picasso as Rembrandt. A related subgenre was the idea of dematerialized or conceptual art, in which the art had no tangible physical form at all. So to cite one particularly infamous example, the American artist Chris Burton once had his friend shoot him in the arm and declared that was the art. Andy Warhol, whose famously subversive and unpredictable works made him one of the founding fathers of postmodernist art, has a famous quote where, in response to someone questioning whether his 6-hour movie of a man sleeping counted as art, he replies by saying, "It was made by an artist, so yeah." This obsession with completely subverting the expectations of what a cultural work was supposed to be, even to the point of offending or annoying the audience, is what has given certain types of postmodernism a reputation for being aggressively bizarre just for the hell of it.
I don't get all this eyeball stuff. What are they supposed to represent? Eyeballs?
It's Pomo. Postmodern. Yeah, all right. Weird for the sake of weird.
Oh.
Postmodernist musicians like the notorious Yoko Ono, or the entire genre of so-called Japanese noise bands, would intentionally stage performances that were almost physically painful to endure, while postmodern fashion designers like Alexander McQueen made outfits that were too impractical to ever wear. Some postmodern things got so extreme they basically couldn't even exist. The ultra-postmodernist playwright Sarah Kane once wrote a play called 4.48 Psychosis that was more or less impossible to perform because the script is just a lot of seemingly random sentences without any stage direction, such as,
"A consolidated consciousness resides in a darkened banqueting hall, near the ceiling of a mind whose floor shifts, as 10,000 cockroaches, when a shaft of light enters, as all thoughts unite, in an instant accord of body no longer expellent, as the cockroaches comprise a truth, which no one ever utters."
At several points, the script is just a series of random numbers. Now, not all postmodernist cultural works had to go quite this far. More moderate postmodernist stuff tends to subvert forms and expectations in a way that is more playful than aggressive. We could say, for instance, that the aesthetics of a lot of stereotypical 90s era product design were motivated by a sort